Basic human rights and freedoms were absolutely decimated throughout the COVID-19 madness. And as logical thought and scientific rationale becomes slowly reinstated, the chilling parallels between Canada and dictatorship China becomes more apparent and makes sense, as details of the Chinese Communist Party's interference into our democracy becomes abundantly clear.
One of the things we've seen, unfortunately, over the past years is a rise in anti-Asian racism linked to the pandemic.
Tamara Ugolini here with Rebel News, and I am going to take you through a recent Globe and Mail article all about how freedom of the press worsened in China during the pandemic with little hope for change as zero COVID lifts, which actually isn't far off from the path that Canada took and is arguably currently still on. The COVID-19 pandemic has been one of the worst periods for press freedom in China in decades, with tough restrictions on movement and a superpowered surveillance state making on-the-ground reporting more difficult than ever. Yet Canadians also face unfounded and unprecedented quashing to their freedom of movement through gathering restrictions, the use of states of emergency to prevent the previously constitutionally protected right to protest. Medical apartheid was normalized in the media with different levels of COVID-19 related restrictions for COVID-19 vaccinated versus unvaccinated people. And then there were times when police interfered with Rebel News' documenting of the entire fiasco. From protests in Toronto to the Montreal police raiding the boat Rebel News had booked to report on their thug-like behavior where they antagonized our team, to the Freedom Convoy that took to the nation's capital in January and February of 2022 to protest government overreach, where our journalists were intimidated and even shot at, arguably by more government overreach. The Globe and Mail article further reads, a bevy of state restrictions, ongoing digital surveillance, and the continued harassment of Chinese colleagues and sources means existing challenges to true freedom of the press in China remain, said the group, which is the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, in its annual Press Freedoms Report. And here in Canada, we have that too. In terms of digital surveillance, well, our very own Public Health Agency of Canada, which is oddly being overseen by China-born Chief Medical Officer of Health, Theresa Tam, whose pandemic response failures were so vast and great that we launched a campaign at firetam.com urging for her removal from this position. Well, her agency surveilled and monitored Canada's compliance with COVID-19 restrictions throughout the pandemic. It was under Tam's leadership or dictatorship that the government agency secretly collected the private mobile data of Canadians to monitor and gauge their compliance with government-instituted mobility restrictions, which was at one time a constitutionally protected right.
The Public Health Agency of Canada confirmed media reports just before Christmas that it had secretly accessed location data for 33 million mobile devices to monitor the movement of Canadians during COVID-19.
The agency used $200,000 worth of taxpayer money to purchase data from private telecommunications company TELUS, and then they hired the company Blue Dot to further collect and analyze Canadians' private mobile data. Through an order paper question in the House of Commons, Conservative MP Blaine Calkins got the Public Health Agency of Canada to further admit to having almost 400 secret COVID-19 related contracts worth nearly $20.6 billion. That's a B. $billion. The disregard of privacy from this shadowy agency is even more alarming as it focuses on behavior modification science and utilizes what is referred to as nudges to condition and shape your behavior and, well, your compliance with whatever it is that the government wants you to do.
We have our own applications too that nudges people or reward them for healthy behaviors or giving them badges or these kind of rewards.
And so many medical professionals, from doctors, scientists, various experts in the field of research, epidemiology, safety, virology, regulations, licensing, you name it. Any dissidents could not come forward in the thick of the knee-jerk COVID response for fear of defaming, punishment, disciplinary action by their regulators, smearing by peers. The level of harassment that people like Dr. Byram Bridle faced when he expressed biodistribution concerns about about the spike protein were unprecedented and is now being exposed as part of a $2.5 million lawsuit against his alleged defamers. This article specifies that, quote, many journalists said they experienced official interference and harassment, end quote. And in Canada, if your viewpoint questions or otherwise goes against the mainstream narrative reporting groupthink, then you don't even necessarily need police to step in to stop your reporting. I mean, they will, but the radicalized groupthink mob will also do it for them, as seen by various reports that Rebel News has done across North America, from squeaky dog toys that are not only annoying, but also completely cancel out any chance of reporting on coherent discussion. Many of them can't have that anyway, to being physically prevented access to events, to flags and signs being intentionally pushed in camera lenses to evade recording, like what happened to Drea Humphrey in British Columbia in recent weeks. David Menzies, he was even physically assaulted by the RCMP while trying to point one simple question to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau late last year, and cameraman Lincoln caught it all. All because this government's media availability becomes smaller and more secretive and increasingly difficult to access, despite freedom of the press being a key component of a healthy democracy. Let's go back to the article. Perhaps the most dramatic escalation has been the tendency to be followed by carloads of officials almost every time we report outside Beijing. Apart from harassing journalists, they intimidate and pressure those we are trying to interview. Well, that very thing happened just a few weeks ago to Rebel's Quebec correspondents Alexa Lavoie and Guillaume. Overall, the article highlights how press freedoms worsened in China during the pandemic, from journalists detained by police for covering protests to harassment and obstruction, and the further threatening of sources, resulting in them being too afraid to come forward and speak to media. All of that has become far too commonplace here in Canada, just the same. And is it any surprise, now knowing that the Justin Trudeau Liberals have been a target for the Chinese Communist Party to infiltrate and meddle in our electoral process, threatening the very democracy that Trudeau says is so fragile?
Let me say that we are extraordinarily lucky and happy to have a member of parliament like Han Dong in our midst, serving his community, serving our country alongside Chinese Canadian MPs from different parts of the country.
It comes at a time when Canada, for the first time in over a decade, no longer ranks among one of the top 10 freest countries in the world, as Canadians face unprecedented and sweeping legislation like Bill C-18 and Bill C-11 that will grant government-run entities like the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission the authority to monitor, control and regulate the internet content that Canadians produce, but also that which they can access online, with steep financial penalties for any wrongdoings. It's becoming clear that we are not working toward restoring freedom, but rather continuing to restrict it. Is it any wonder that under Trudeau's reign, where he himself says he adores China's basic dictatorship,
admiration I actually have for China,
is it any wonder that this country has slipped into communist-style erosion of freedoms as his government becomes compromised by the very regimes that we once denounced? For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. Undoubtedly, freedoms will be further threatened by the imposition of a digital ID. If you want to stay up to date on our reports on the subject and sign our petition to oppose the implementation of digital ID, then head on over to our special website at stopdigitalid.com and sign up today. That's stopdigitalid.com.